apologizes for not being here today. She had to go to Ottawa to do some presenting, but we're very pleased to see you all here, and we do have people online. As you know, we're webcasting, so there will be a form going around getting your signature that you give permission to be webcasted, part of the webcast. Also, we have a few materials over on the counter. Some are about future seminars that we're holding, and a few materials are about a financial literacy workshop. One of Dr. McDonald's grants is looking to provide literacy for older women who have need of it for finances, financial money management. And we've got a 2-day workshop going for that. So there's some materials there. If that interests you at all, please feel free to pick them up or talk to us about it later. I guess that's all I have to say about that. And I just want to say that we are so honored to have with us today Dr. Carol Greenwood. Dr. Greenwood is talking today, as you all know, about nutrition, aging, and the brain, and has long studied the connection between food intake and cognitive function. So we're really excited she could be here today to speak with us. She is from Kuhn and Lunenfeld Applied Research Unit, thank you, at Baycrest, and I believe co-director there?
I'm an interim director.
An interim director there. And also is on part of the University of Toronto staff at in the Department of Nutrition, and a senior scientist as well at Baycrest in the Kuhn and Lunenfeld Applied Research Unit. So thank you, Carol, for coming today, and we'll welcome you.
Perfect. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to speak. The one thing I wanted to say is if anyone has questions, sometimes the discourse actually works better if you ask me the question during the talk rather than waiting to the end. So I'm more than pleased to answer talks as we go along. The one thing I want to do in terms of orienting you, and I think it probably orients everyone to how we think about cognitive aging in general, and the fact that we know that chronologic age tells us very little in terms of where somebody is cognitively, and I think that probably crosses a number of different areas of health as it associates with aging, and we all typically think of the 75-year-old who's still active and working, and we contrast that with the 75-year-old who's quite progressed in terms of dementia. So chronological age is not telling us anything, but it's telling us that we have a huge capacity at one level in terms of being able to alter our risk profile in terms of where we're going to sit at 75 years of age. So that I want to give you the perspective that there are things that we can do in terms of helping our brain health with aging, lowering our risk in terms of experiencing cognitive decline, and lowering our risk in terms of experiencing dementia. So we're going to come from a very optimistic perspective in terms of that. What I'm trying to get across on this particular slide is that this is really just looking at courses of 3 different individuals as they transition through their lifespan, and that we talk about sort of areas of cognitive function that we would consider normal, areas where we're calling it mild cognitive impairment, and these people are below normal but haven't yet transitioned into dementia, and we would consider that these individuals are high-risk individuals in terms of dementia, and those that are actually now clinically diagnosed in terms of having a dementia. And you can see that these people are crossing those various hallmarks at very different ages. This is likely somebody that may have a genetic predisposition to dementia, or alternatively may have had some sort of a head injury that's accelerated their cognitive decline. But one of the things that you can see is cognitive decline isn't something that starts at 65. That this is not a retirement-related issue, that we are seeing issues associated with the aging of our brain that are going out through our entire lifespan, and that it's the accumulation of those various changes as we get older and older that we're more likely to actually see it in terms of a cognitive deficit. We're also very interested in these people, sort of the individual who seems to be going on a normal course. We probably wouldn't even be able to detect any differences in this individual between relative to a 20-year-old until they reached about 40. On the other hand, this this person probably wouldn't be able to detect any differences relative to an individual until they're almost 75 years of age. And this would be the kind of breadth that we would naturally see in the population. And we talk about that as being a component of cognitive reserve. So being able to build an excess capacity in terms of our brain function, and that as we start to age, that we have that excess capacity in order to be able to draw on. And I try to put it into the same analogy that we think of in terms of osteoporosis. So as women, in terms of trying to reduce our risk of osteoporosis, one of the very first things we're taught is build that bone mineral density when we're adolescents and make sure that you're taking in all of your calcium. And then the second thing is that we're taught is use those bones, do weight-bearing exercises throughout your lifespan in order to help you preserve that bone density as you age. And I'm arguing that the brain actually you can put into the same analogy. That you can do things in terms of building your cognitive reserve in youth, and then there are other things that we can do in terms of maintaining that reserve as we age. Clearly, the more reserve we have, better we're going to function cognitively, and even if we are going to develop dementias, we're going to develop those dementias much later in life. So with all of this increased knowledge, then we argue that our primary goal as we look at issues around brain aging is looking what do we need to do to build this reserve, and then what do we need to do in order to be able to maintain it. Over time, we've known that there are many different lifestyle-related factors that are key contributors in terms of the amount of cognitive reserve that we have. And this is sort of listed from the Alzheimer's Society of Canada webpage. But just about all of the Alzheimer's societies throughout the world now have similar bullets in terms of things that we should be focusing on in terms of successful brain aging. So I chose to put diet first. They don't always necessarily do that. But the other ones are kind of here. So one is here from being active, they're meaning maintaining physical activity. Staying connected is making certain that we continue to have social interaction and social engagement in terms of stimulating ourselves. Keeping your brain active would be talking about either doing cognitively stimulating activities, so whether that's learning a new instrument or a new language or playing bridge or doing crossword puzzles and Sudoku, all of these things are engaging your cognitive processes and continuing to do that. Taking charge of your health would be looking in terms of the negative impact of high blood pressure and high lipids, elevated cholesterol, making sure that you're seeing your family physician, and if you have any of these diseases, that you're doing the right thing in terms of controlling them. That's sometimes easier said than done in terms of reducing your stress, and then finally being serious about your safety. And this is really talking more in terms of doing things that will help you minimize the likelihood of experiencing a brain injury. So that if you're involved in sport, making sure that you're wearing helmets and bring protective gear. Obviously, some of these things are going to be targeted more towards younger populations rather than seniors. But all of these have been associated with the likelihood of preserving our cognitive function for longer and longer periods of time. Where it becomes really interesting as a biologic phenomenon is that as we look across this really diverse set of lifestyle components, is they all seem to be impacting the same biologic system. So whether we're talking about being a master chess player, or whether we're talking about being a cyclist, or whether we're talking about eating healthily, while those are all very different activities, the brain, in terms of the preservation of the biologic functions, it seems to be converging. And all of that seems to be converging on these processes that contribute to cognitive plasticity and cognitive reserve. So cognitive plasticity would relate to the fact that throughout our lifespan, we can continue to make new connections between nerve cells. We can actually have some birth and differentiation of new cells, neurogenesis, and that is, if you look at what differentiates at some levels, at a biologic level, a brain that has a lot of cognitive reserve and a brain that has less, is its ability to continue to engage in plasticity. Our ability to be able to engage in these processes that we term plasticity does decrease a little bit with age, but the more we exercise, the better our lifestyles, the more we can continue to hold on to these biologic processes. And as a consequence, the more we can conserve our cognitive reserve. So that what I was arguing is that conceptually, when we look at lifestyle, that it really is arguing at one level is that it provides the biologic environment that enables this plasticity. But I think the other piece of it then is really important, is that it's correcting any one environmental contributor is unlikely to be affected in isolation. So can you go away from this talk and say, okay, if I improve my diet, I don't have to exercise, I don't have to worry about being socially engaged? And the answer to that is no. If you're going to form a bridge club, does it mean that you don't have to worry about your diet or your activity? No. That we're really talking about collective processes that are working on the same biologic systems. Where that becomes particularly important for me is that when we start to translate that into areas around nutrition. So that it's very common that people are looking for the key nutrient that they need to consume in order to be able to conserve their brain function. So can I take vitamin C? Can I take vitamin E? Can I do any of these things? And will that help offset a bad diet? And the answer to that is no. That we really are looking across diet and that we're not going to come to the end of this talk in terms of saying that there's a magic bullet. If you go out and take a vitamin C tab, does that mean that you can go home and eat poutine and hamburger for dinner? And the answer to that is no. We're not going to come, but rather we're looking across a host of the impact of our diet. So in general, when we're starting to really unravel some of what's going on, is that if you stand back, I think everybody here is going to agree that obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, high blood cholesterol, and type 2 diabetes are lifestyle diseases. Anyone going to fight that? And they're not going to fight the fact that nutrition is part of the lifestyle that contributes to the risk, as is exercise and other types of things. I think what hasn't been well communicated is that each of these are risk factors for dementia. So the more likely you are to have hypertension, high blood cholesterol, diabetes, obesity, all of those facts independently increase the risk of cognitive decline, and they independently increase the risk of dementia. And why I'm arguing independently so strongly is that if we look at one of the most growing disorders in our population today, it's something that's called the metabolic syndrome. And the metabolic syndrome, by definition, is somebody that has at least 3 of those disorders. So that I call the metabolic syndrome the pousse café of cognitive risk. Because once you've got that categorization of metabolic syndrome, it is already telling you you are carrying 3 independent risk factors for cognitive decline, and that those are going to function in an additive manner in terms of increasing the likelihood that you're going to see accelerated cognitive decline or dementia. So once you put this into perspective in terms of is nutrition and lifestyle going to play a role, you can see that there's a huge capacity that is going to be arguing that if we don't control those disorders that commonly develop and used to commonly develop in our 50s and expose brain to the negative consequences of that over 30 or 40 years, I think where we're really getting sobering thoughts is that we're now seeing things like type 2 diabetes entering into our population in 6-year-olds. And we're saying that type 2 diabetes is bad for the brain. And so we know it's bad for the brain if you develop it at 50 and you've got 20 years of exposure and you're picking up its consequences at 70. What's it going to mean now when we have kids that have 60 years of exposure to the disease in terms of the consequences of that disorder on the brain? So the more we get in an obesogenic environment, the more we're seeing these obesity-related disorders in the population. It's increasing concern as it relates to the maintenance of cognitive health and the impact that that's going to have as we age. So we've got tons and tons and tons of data that argue that the traditional high-fat, low-fiber, low-fruit and vegetable North American diet is not good for our brains. A whole bunch of this is going to relate to the disorders that we just talked about, some of it will be brain-specific effects. And the evidence comes from prospective human population-based studies, comes from clinical trials, it comes from animal experimentation. So if you start to look across the diversity of the evidence that we have, it is very strong. And conversely, you can imagine if we're saying that a Western-style diet is bad, it's saying that a Prudence-style diet is superior. So diets that are rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grain fish seem to be better associated with preservation of cognitive function as we age. I think we've also had some insight in terms of the types of biologic processes that are positively affected by high-quality diets. The one is that I'll argue is that it sustains brain insulin signaling, and traditionally we don't think of insulin as being an important hormone for the brain. But I think that while we recognize that it's not needed in terms of how we metabolize or handle glucose, that insulin actually is needed in the brain in order to be able to support learning and memory. So that you can imagine with people with diabetes that have insulin-related disorders and those pathways or signals associated with insulin become disturbed, that is going to read out as difficulty in terms of particularly consolidating new information so that you're putting it into memory and being able to withdraw it. We also know that a high-quality diet then is going to maintain the brain chemicals, or what we call neurotrophins, that help support these brain plasticity processes. It's going to help reduce neuroinflammation and oxidative damage. And obviously we need to maintain the health of our cerebral vasculature so that we get adequate blood flow to be able to deliver the oxygen and the nutrients. Diet is having a whole host of beneficial effects on the brain. The other important piece of this is the nutrients that we need for this are different nutrients than we need for that, different nutrients that we need for that, and different nutrients that we need for this. So we cannot bring this down to one nutrient. So that simply arguing, I think we've all heard recently that an adequate level of B12 was associated with increased risk of dementia, and probably the B12 was working down here, and a little bit in terms of signaling. But even though you could bump the B12 levels perhaps in those individuals, that you're still not going to have the anti-inflammatory or oxidative protective nutrients. You're still not going to have all of the nutrients that are associated with maintaining the plasticity environment. So when I argue that there isn't a single magic bullet from a nutrition perspective, is that as we age, we want to make sure that we're maintaining all of these processes occurring concurrently, and that we need a good profile of nutrients in order to be able to do this, and we cannot explain it on the basis of any one single nutrient in our diet. So part of it is saying that we have this whole host of biologic processes that we're trying to support, but the other piece of it is that in reality, nutrient deficiencies rarely exist in isolation. So if you come to me and you have a very poor intake of vitamin C, it's probably telling me you're not eating more fruits and vegetables. So it's also telling me that you're not being exposed to the other nutrients that are in fruits and vegetables. So giving you a vitamin C tablet to replace the fruit and vegetable in your diet is not replacing the other nutrients, like the huge, wonderful, powerful antioxidants of fruit and vegetables. So that fact that we may pick it up as a single nutrient in your blood measures is really telling us more about the fact that you have a poor quality diet, rather than you have a very specific single isolated deficiency of any one nutrient. Then as we were arguing is that because these multiple processes are involved, that we cannot really bring that down to a single nutrient, and that the relationship between a single nutrient and cognitive decline may simply be giving me an indication that somebody's consuming a poor quality diet. I think we've gone a long journey in terms of going from nutrition to the whole diet perspective. And I'm going to bring you through a little bit of this journey because I think it's important in terms of how you respond as you're hearing public media information around diet. So that we started out by trying to understand the association between diet quality and cognitive decline by doing population-based studies, preferentially prospective, so that we're looking at people over periods of time. And we collect information about their diet, about the foods that they're consuming, and we translate that into nutrients. So if I know what you had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner today, I can tell you how much protein and vitamin C and all those types of things that you eat. We then took those individual nutrients and tried to look at associations, and indeed, we did see associations that too many calories, inappropriate consumption, and too much fat was bad. We were eating too much of the saturated, too little of the omega-3s. Clustered into what I call those cardioprotective vitamins, folate and B12, and then poor intake of antioxidants, which we're picking up as vitamin E and carotenoids. So you are hearing at the public level that poor folate and B12 status is associated with increased cognitive decline. So we got translated in a public dissemination of the information, and you heard very little about what that meant in terms of foods. But that at the same time, in order to have these profiles of inadequate nutrients, it also meant that your diet was poor in fruits, vegetables, and cereal, and you probably weren't eating a whole lot of fish, because that's what we do in order to be able to create that. So our information was being disseminated at the level of the nutrient and not at the level of food. So we then into going, saying, well, if I know the nutrient that's associated, can I just pop a pill, and then I don't have to worry about my diet? So I argue that there is not a single nutrient to provide a quick fix. But the other thing that we go through in terms of a process to understand what it is about foods that make them particularly healthy or particularly protective in terms of disease is that we could start with an understanding of a profile of a healthy diet. We would then study one food at a time, because we can't do that many different foods in the laboratory. We would take that food and we would try to determine what we call the bioactive compounds in the food. So what are the individual chemicals that seem to be associated with greater antioxidant protection? Lycopenes in tomatoes would be an example that you've probably all heard of. So that was in giving us information in terms of what was about the tomato that meant that you had better antioxidant protection. But rather than using that information from the laboratory to inform public health policy as it related to encouraging the intake of fruit and vegetables, we've had more and more likelihood to go down this road. We take that biologic compound, we either isolate it and market it, or we talk about putting it into unhealthy foods. And I would argue that taking extract of broccoli and putting it into a French fry and not having to worry about whether or not you're eating like this is not going to solve the problem. Yet somehow or another, from a marketing perspective, this seems to be the path that we're taking. So it's almost encouraging people to stay here because science is going to tell us what we need to put into this French fry so that you don't have to worry about whether or not you're asking for a slice of tomato on your hamburger. The other piece, I think, where it's going wrong in terms of the translation of discovery in the laboratory is that, as I was mentioning, is that we really, just out of practical reasons, can only study one or two foods at a time. We just don't have the capacity to study a whole bunch of different things. So if I'm interested in berries, very unlikely that I'm going to look at an experiment that's looking across all berries. I'm probably going to look at one or two at a time. And we all know that blueberries has a lot of investigation on it. I will absolutely say that blueberries do have very high levels of antioxidants in them, and they probably have slightly higher than other berries. But what's happening is that we come into spring, we have our brand new fresh strawberries, they're coming in, we're picking them the ripest possible because there's no delivery, they're absolutely jam-packed with nutrients and flavor and all of that type of thing, and we buy blueberries. We then get to the situation where our raspberries are now available. Same thing. I mean, what's better than an Ontario-grown raspberry when it's juicy and full of all of its nutrients, and we go into the grocery store and we buy blueberries. Well, late fall comes along, or blueberries are finally available on the marketplace, but last week I was told that pomegranates had a lot of antioxidants, so now I run and I buy my pomegranate. And then we get to the point where I'm going to the grocery store, and I now know that pomegranates are good, so I'm planning to buy a pomegranate. And I've just heard this study being released in the news that was published in JAMA, or the Journal of the American Medical Association, saying that intake of white fruit, pears and apples, seem to protect against stroke. And then you're saying, what the heck is going on? Well, it is true that we have been encouraging people to consume darkly flavored fruits and vegetables because they are chock full of antioxidants. But this is telling us that the protective role of fruits and vegetables are more than just their antioxidant properties. That there is something else in fruits and vegetables. In the case of apples and pears, it's likely that they're very rich in fibers that help us keep our cholesterol levels down. And that fruit and vegetables are healthy. But you're hearing blueberries, pomegranates next week. Who knows what it's going to be the week after? And you're chasing those cherries because that's the way we're communicating it to you. I'm not blaming you. That's how you're getting communicated. But nobody is stepping back and saying the original epidemiologic data was telling us that diets high in fruits and vegetables were associated with better preservation of cognitive function. That we have indications in terms of different types of health benefits, brain health benefits that come from different types of fruits and vegetables. We have no evidence whatsoever that any one fruit is more beneficial than another as it relates to cognitive health. Yet, it's not getting that global piece. And where we lose on that tremendously is that it distances ourselves from the normal growth cycle of our own crops in Canada. So that we know that the closer you are to the source of your local foods, they are picked in a much riper condition because they don't have to withstand long times in terms of traveling. They're going to have richer food, vitamin, mineral, nutrient composition. So we're losing our rhythm in terms of our own local availability because we're being driven by other market forces that are sending us away from our own natural cycles of food in Canada. And it's also, in my mind, medicalizing our diet. And I don't think that that's a healthy thing to do. So that diet is very unique in some ways in the life of an individual in that it plays a very important medical role. It provides us with the nutrients that we need in order to be able to sustain health. But it also plays an equally huge, important social role. And that we're saying that some of the things that we need to be able to do as we age in order to be able to preserve that cognitive function is stay socially connected. And using food and family and all of those types of things is a very important mechanism for us to be able to create that social connectivity. And the more we medicalize our food and we look at our plate as being a prescription, the less we're enjoying that other hugely important social aspect of nutrition. And so I think it's really, we have to think long term of the psychological consequences of medicalizing a part of our lives which is very natural and normal, and that it also gives us those opportunities in terms of social engagement. The other important piece is that if we look in terms of those individually bioactive compounds that we may have in foods, and we set up the clinical trial and we give people the tablets to take on top of their normal diet, we have not had one successful clinical trial. Maybe one or two, but the balance of the evidence says that we have no evidence that taking a nutrient in isolation is going to do anything to protect cognitive health. And that's across antioxidants, it's across vitamin B12 and folate, it's across fish oils, it's across a whole bunch of things. So we are getting more and more data knowing that the individual nutrient is not the way to go as it relates to preservation of cognitive health. So that we're trying to understand at this point what it is that we have a disconnect between the epidemiologic data that argues that diets high in fruits and vegetables are neuroprotective, versus the clinical trial that if we isolate a nutrient from fruits and vegetables and provide it, we cannot see any evidence that it's providing protection. So that one of the thoughts then comes back in terms of saying, if I'm just correcting one of many multiple nutrient deficiencies, I may not be doing enough. So the vitamin C, I may be bringing your vitamin C back up, but you're still not getting the other things that are naturally present in fruits and vegetables. The question in terms of exposure is also an issue. So most of the clinical trials in this area probably lasted somewhere between 3 weeks and a month, a couple that are 6 months and a year. But I keep arguing that I probably started eating food when I left my mother's womb, and that so I've had many years of exposure to diet, and maybe a short period of time like that is not enough to be able to reverse some of the consequences of the diet that I've consumed. There's also an argument that there's a critical period, so that we have more of a tendency to look at these types of clinical trials in individuals that are generally 70 and above. In many instances, we're targeting people that are already showing low levels of cognitive function, actually asking if we can reverse that. And it may be that we really should have been starting to look at the impact of improving the diet in middle age rather than waiting in terms of older age. That the other argument is that if we're getting people that are already starting to show that cognitive decline, that maybe diet functions best to help us sustain function, but that it's not a strong enough treatment in order to try and reverse the disease process. And then back to my bandwagon, I don't think there's a single nutrient that actually can reverse the impact of a poor quality diet. I think we also have to then look in terms of the fact that we have wonderful evidence in terms of prudent diet eating, which refers to high fruits and vegetables and all of those types of things, disseminating that information and how it's taken up. And the real problem that we know from a nutrition perspective is that we often don't reach the right target group. So that what happens is if we're making comments in terms of need to increase certain nutrients in our diet, that is generally most often heard by people that are already conscious of lifestyle and health. So those people are probably already consuming a healthy diet, and that probably is not the group that we need to encourage in order to be able to take those supplements. Yep.
And just thinking about that, we do also read about how the food we're eating, even if it's healthy, like the broccoli and whatever, is not actually giving us the nutrients that it used to, or because of changes in growing habits or in genetic strain or whatever. And so we're being encouraged to take the supplements on top of a healthy diet, because we're actually, if we just ate what you would call a healthy diet.
Yeah, and who's encouraging you to do that? Supplement manufacturers.
Yeah, probably.
And it's also food that's irradiated.
I think there's all these things that this one the irradiation was a process that was being brought in that was trying to look at ways to be able to help preserve food during shipping. And so that if you could irradiate, kill any bacteria that was sterile, then you should have a longer shelf life of that food. And clearly it's one that has had a lot of public debate on it. I'm not aware that irradiation itself would destroy any of the nutrients. And I don't know if there's anybody else in the audience here that's coming from a nutrition background that knows of nutrients that are susceptible to irradiation. So I think it was a little bit more of that there may be other concerns in terms of using radiation as a form of sterilizing. But from a pure nutritional perspective, I'm not aware of it. I think the thing that does not get adequately talked about, and I really think it's important, because most people that are living in lower socioeconomic strata really feel that they're being disadvantaged from a nutritional perspective because they can't afford the higher priced, fresher, organic foods and all of those types of things. brutal reality is that, particularly for freezing on these large mega farms, is that the tractor is putting food directly into the processor on the field, so that the foods there are getting picked very ripe, they're very nutrition dense, and they're getting flash frozen on the field. And actually, as a method of preserving nutrition content of fruits and vegetables, it is fabulous. That the foods that's more susceptible to have loss of nutrition are the foods that are being picked underripe so that they can be shipped and sold fresh in the supermarket. So that, particularly in the winter months when we're importing our foods from great distances, we have a lot of loss of nutrients during the delivery process. So the brutal reality is you probably get more nutrition out of your broccoli in the winter by buying frozen broccoli rather than eating fresh. Now, I choose to eat fresh broccoli in the winter because I still like the taste and the texture and all of those types of things as fresh. But nobody's telling you that if you're really worried about nutrition depletion of your crops during the winter months with these long shipping periods, you should actually just go to the freezer section of your grocery store. And it's also not being communicated, I think, to people with lower income, that they're not disadvantaging themselves and their children by not being able to afford fresh. That they're getting as good nutrition out of buying frozen fruit and vegetables. And I wish that that was somehow or another communicated more strongly, because we have so many women that are living in lower socioeconomic strata where they are just so guilt-ridden about the fact that they can't afford fresh fruits and vegetables for their children, and they feel that they're disadvantaging their children, and actually that's not the case. As long as they're bringing in, the carrots and, sort of the inexpensive fruits and vegetables that are around, they're relying on fresh and frozen, or on the frozen, that actually they're feeding their children well in terms of nutrient availability. So I really do wish that that's there. The argument then that would be pro not relying only on local and eating foods from different geographic locations, to a certain extent comes back to a piece of the issue that you were talking about, and that's concern that over time soils become depleted of certain nutrients. So I know at one point there was concern, particularly up in the Holland Marsh area, that some of that soil was getting depleted in selenium, and so consequently the crops that were being grown in there were somewhat low in selenium. And where it became an issue wasn't from a human perspective, but I guess that there's a lot of grains that are growing up in that, and some of our prime thoroughbred horses were eating local grains, and then those animals were underperforming as it went into the racing events. And then it was ultimately found that, we didn't have enough selenium in our soil, and so that was solved by mixing local grain with grain that was imported by the prairies. Because you may have different soils in different parts of the country being depleted in different ways, and so the more we eat globally, in that sense, the more likely it is that we would help protect ourselves against anything that would be unique to our own environment. So I am giving a bit of a mixed message. I'm saying that, in the summer months, in the early fall, when our crops are coming out of the ground and they're being picked fresh, and they're chock full of nutrients, buy local. But the brutal reality is that during the winter months we're having to buy international anyway, unless we're buying Canadian fruit and vegetable that was frozen in Canada and put into our freezers. But in a certain way, because we can't buy local in the winter, it's forcing us to become more broadly exposed to foods at the same time. So I think we end up, kind of getting the best of both worlds simply because of the types of climatic changes that we would experience. The other piece then, I think, when it comes to the supplements is sort of an emerging piece of evidence and increasing concern that we may actually be getting to the point where people are overexposing themselves to nutrients. So that this is work that is with a colleague of mine, Valerie Tarasuk, and her graduate student, Jocelyn Sacco. And these are all just conceptual models, but I think it's pointing to the risk and the concern that we have. And this is with folate, and where folate is particularly important is probably about 7 or 8 years ago, in both Canada and the US, we brought in policy that really was mandatory fortification of certain foods with folate. And the reason that that was being done is that folate deficiency was associated with increased risk of neural tube defect. That is a developmental disorder that occurs in the first trimester of pregnancy when women are not usually aware of the fact that they're pregnant, and by the time they know they're pregnant, it's too late in terms of that developmental disorder. And so by putting more folate into the food supply, it was argued that we would help bump up the folate exposure of women sort of prior to conception, and that we would lower the risk of neural tube defect. Well, that was the prime motivator from an aging perspective. We were also arguing that low levels of folate, particularly in older adults, can be associated with increased levels of depression. We also know that folate is important in terms of maintaining our vasculature and maintaining our cerebral vasculature with aging. So the general feeling is that while the 19-year-old was motivated the policy, that it should also be beneficial for the older adult at the same time. Well, there's a couple of things that have happened in terms of problems, I think, with those types of thoughts, and as it expands is, one is that a lot of family physicians, when they knew that their patients were planning to conceive, were putting them onto prenatal vitamins. Those prenatal vitamins have gobs of folate, and they never got reformulated after we started mandatory folate fortification. So that now we're even increasing the exposure to folate more and more. And now we're looking at opening our policies in a way that we will put less regulation on foods that can have vitamins and minerals added to them. So it used to be that water was water. Well, I mean, water's not water. I mean, now water is like a source of vitamin C, and whatever it is you want to buy in your water. I mean, why can't we just have water, right? But you can imagine as we start to bring all of these extra nutrients in a unregulated fashion, and for people that buy a lot of these fortified foods, they're probably also our supplement users, and they're probably already eating a healthy amount of those nutrients in the diet because they're health conscious, is they run the risk from having this type of a profile on average in terms of their folate consumption to shifting it so their folate intake is up here. And where that's a problem is too much folate. It's toxic. So we have no difficulty talking about a safe range of medication where we know if we don't take enough of a medication, we're not going to get a therapeutic effect. And we don't double up on our medication because that could bring us into toxicity. And we have this range that we call the therapeutic range, which is enough that we're having an effect and not too much that we're running into toxic problems. Taking a drug, we don't worry about that though. Nutrients are the same. We have safe ranges of exposures. And if we start now having people taking folate in their food, taking folate in their prenatal supplement, taking other supplements on top of it, drinking folate fortified beverages, we are increasingly finding that what we're doing is we're shifting part of the population into excess exposure to nutrients. So that again, assuming that simply because something is coming from nature and I can extract it and put it in a pill and it's going to be healthy, is not the case. And I think as we're looking through this type of modeling and what that can mean in terms of taking those segments of the population that actually were fine. They were eating diets high in fruits, vegetables, and cereals. They were doing just fine. But they're the people that are more concerned about their health. They're more likely to respond to these types of products coming on the market simply because of their health consciousness. and because of that, they're more likely to be putting themselves at risk when they would have been better off not doing it at all. Yet the people that were consuming the Western style diet, they're not likely to put the extra money on the table to buy fortified food.
Yep. I just wanted to say I'm in Valerie's class right now. And she went over this paper. And two things she brought up was the concept of overage with manufacturers, like when fortification occurred. So in order to keep the amount of folate on the shelf or in a product, they put more. And then she also said that occurs in supplements.
Yeah.
So something to occur and something to think about, because our project was related to vitamin D.
Oh, okay.
So after researching that, I found overage levels, like in the research, found up to 50% in supplements.
Wow.
So it's just to account, so you never know how much you get.
Right. So just so as bad as this picture is, so just so that people understand the concept here is that if you take a 100 milligram tablet of vitamin C, the manufacturer really, from a legal perspective, has to ensure that that has at least 100 milligrams in it. So they will probably start at about 150 milligrams in that tablet, so that if there's any loss when it's sitting on the shelf, or if there's, the tablet is just a tiny little bit smaller or whatever, so that's the overage, is that in order to know that they are meeting their legal obligation of making sure that there's 100 milligrams in there, they'll likely make a 150 milligram tablet. And we'll see the same thing as it relates to putting nutrients into foods. So if we're basing it on the number in the tablet, chances are we're even underestimating more what all of this could mean. So through all of that, I think what's happened in the journey of nutrition is that we've turned much more back to diets and tried to move away from looking at it as a single nutrient perspective. And probably the diet pattern that has had the most amount of press is the Mediterranean diet. We've all heard that the Mediterranean diet is healthy. It's a diet that's very high in whole grains, fruits and vegetables. That as we moved up, it's got fair intake in terms of fish and poultry, and that while you're not being told to abstain from red meat, that it's something that your exposure should be monthly rather than weekly or daily. And I keep arguing as we make this transition in terms of the way we eat in North America, that all is okay because you're allowed to have less red wine. So that there is always some benefits. We have good evidence that people that eat more of a Mediterranean style diet are at lower risk in terms of cognitive decline and dementia. And I think where this evidence is really important is that the studies by Nikos Skarmias that I'm referring to here, he actually works in rural New York, or in urban New York City. So we're not looking about people living in the Mediterranean, living this graceful Mediterranean lifestyle, showing improvements and benefits associated with their diet. This is translating the Mediterranean diet and looking at diet patterns in poor, less wealthy areas of New York City, and still being able to see the benefits. So I think it is talking about a diet issue and not a Mediterranean lifestyle issue. But the real question then becomes, is there anything superior about the Mediterranean diet versus overall healthy eating? And I'd have to argue no. That a Mediterranean style diet is just one example of a healthy diet. But that there are many other examples of healthy diets that are out there. And that can we have the same protection with modeling these using other indices of healthful eating? And the answer to that is yes. And the only caveat is that there is strong evidence related to regular intake of fish. So making sure we have those omega-3s. So again, we seem to be looking for the magic bullet. If I eat Mediterranean, I'm going to be okay. But does that mean that an Asian diet can't be healthy? And the answer to that is no. I mean, we have to be thinking more globally.
Yeah. The fish question is a bit puzzling to me because we're getting the other message that fish concentrates certain toxins.
Yes. So the question there is much more of whether to purchase the more expensive wild fish when you go into your grocery store, or whether to purchase the farm-raised fish. So I think a lot of it comes down to issues of trust. There is no question that with the meals that they feed fish when they're farming them, is that they do end up with slightly concentrated levels of some of the toxins that are already in our oceans relative to the wild fish, and that is fair to argue. So it comes down to how much you trust the Health Canada regulations as it relates to exposures and safe exposures. And I happen to trust them, and some people don't, and we're just differences of opinion here. Because if you put it into perspective, and I don't remember the exact numbers, that a lot of the Health Canada guidelines were saying that most of the evidence that we had is that we could tolerate exposures of, let's say, up to 100 parts per day, just in terms of drawing the numbers, and that there was no evidence of harm at that level of intake. And when we were talking about the differences between the wild and the farmed fish, we were talking about the wild having 10 parts and the wild having 10 and the farmed having 15. So it was true that the farmed had more, but both of them were way, 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 way from what we thought was a safe level of exposure. And that piece of it never made the press. Do I feel that that we can still safely eat the farmed fish that are sold in the marketplace today? And the answer to that is yes. But it's because I trust those guidelines, right? The other thing, and the other caveat there, is that I think where it's really important as you're eating fish is, particularly if you're an angler and you're catching your own fish, that we very much know that the quality of water in lakes in Ontario is very different from one lake to another. But the ministry puts out a booklet on every lake in Ontario and what is safe to eat out of that lake. And so where we may have to modify is that if I'm wanting to go to a cottage and I'm wanting to catch my fish and decide whether or not I want to put it in my frying pan for dinner, that it's going to somewhat depend on the quality of that lake water. But those fish will never reach the marketplace. So I would say farmed or wild. If you can afford the wild, because it's usually got a stronger flavor, and if you like the flavor of fish, go for it. But do I think that we're increasing our risk by consuming the farmed fish that are available in the marketplace? I don't personally.
Apparently the labeling of fish is very suspect. There's been quite a bit in the media lately about the fact that when you buy fish that is labeled as being such and such from so-and-so, it is not in fact true, that it's mislabeled. Something, the statistic that sticks in my mind is something like 1 in 4 fish that you buy
That there is actually
is incorrectly sourced and labeled.
Yeah, and I honestly don't know the details of that, so I can't respond to the question. I guess I can just look in terms of saying that once we're at this level, you can virtually be guaranteed that Health Canada is going to kick in and make certain that I mean, there's a whole division of Health Canada that really is entrusted with making certain that labeling is accurate and not misconceiving to the public and stuff like that. And so once these types of things surface, I can only imagine how many of those Health Canada people are directed in terms of making sure that that this is corrected. I mean, because I don't know the issue, I'm just not able to comment on it directly. The other piece, though, that I was wanting to talk about as we look in terms of, so I think I'm getting across the message probably in terms of saying that if you're really interested in what you need to do from a nutrition perspective as it relates to preserving your cognitive health with aging, that you're going to eat lots of fruits, vegetables, grain, and fish, right? I mean, have we all kind of agreed that I've gotten that message across? But I think there's an important lifestyle issue here in that generally, and you remember that ultimately what we're wanting to do is maintain our cognitive reserve as we age. And that there's a whole bunch of different lifestyle factors that feed into that cognitive reserve. And that again, the same way that nutrients cluster in foods, behaviors cluster. So in general, people that are more health conscious are usually people that are more educated, which also means that they are likely to have higher incomes. They're people that are likely to be more socially engaged and active. And all of these are factors that are contributing to the cognitive reserve, while individuals that have one negative aspect to their lifestyle usually have multiple. So if we're looking at the benefit of diet, are we simply looking at the prototypical individual that is eating a high quality diet? And this is some work that was done by a student of mine where it's a group of healthy seniors in Quebec that we had by now been looking at over 4 years of time. And we were looking at a global score of their cognitive function. And we divided the group into those that had at least 11 years of education, remembering in Quebec that that's where you graduate from high school, and individuals that had less than a high school education. And then also divided into individuals who were eating a diet that was very Western-like, and so the high-fat, low-fruit vegetable, versus the individuals whose diet was more prudent-like, higher in fruits and vegetables. You can see that people with a higher education didn't seem to matter in this particular study, the quality of their diet, and I argue that that's no different from Winston Churchill being able to tolerate a fifth of brandy every day because he probably had other aspects that kept him engaged. Whereas if we had people with lower income, they were much more sensitive to the adverse effect of the lower quality diet. So that's who I was talking about. Sometimes these things can compound on one another. And we just reported the same type of thing as it related to a looking at sodium content of the diets of these very same individuals. And we divided them into individuals that had high levels of activity and low levels of activity. And this is how much they declined over the period of time that we were studying them. Greater decline, the worse they're doing. And what you're seeing here is it didn't seem to matter whether they were consuming a low sodium or a high sodium diet as long as they were physically active, probably meaning that the activity was keeping their vascular system safe or protected. But take the low activity individual and put them onto a moderate or high sodium diet, and this was the group that was showing huge susceptibility to the higher sodium exposures. And I argue that these are real people with real activities, and this is your couch potato that makes popcorn before they sit down to watch the television. The sobering is that while we broke our sodium intakes into 3, that it was only this low sodium group that was consuming at or below Canadian recommendations for upper limits of salt intake. 2/3 of our seniors are consuming more salt in their diet than we recommend, and we're arguing that if you combine that high salt and low activity, that can contribute to escalated rates of cognitive decline. I argue that this is particularly relevant to the cohort of women that are aging right now. Because if we start to look at this combined effect of lifestyle, that we know that because of the cultural norms at the time when these women were aging, as a baby boomer, I'm probably that first wave of women that really were encouraged to become independent and to get educated and to do all of those types of things. And that group just in front of me were not. So that the women in the next cohort to mine were less likely to get advanced education. If they worked then because they weren't educated, they were not as likely to have cognitively stimulating positions, consequently less pay, more likely to be experiencing social isolation with divorce or widowhood. So that cohort of women, as we look to those lifestyle characteristics that contribute to cognitive reserve, because of the cultural norms, have disadvantaged them. And we know that 2/3 of many women go on to develop dementia relative to men. And the issue that they're trying to sort out is how much of it is physiologic and related to differences in terms of hormones, and how much of it has this social component to it. So even though women are more likely to have a better quality diet and men in general, that our culturalization of the current cohort of older women have likely disadvantaged them because of other aspects that contribute to cognitive plasticity. Whether we'll continue to see the gender divide as the baby boomers are entering into older age, where we don't have as much discrimination in terms of education, socioeconomic status, and living in isolation. I think we don't know. We're the guinea pigs that will bring that type of data. So as we kind of come to an end, I think I've kind of convinced you that eating healthy is good. That really looking at that across your whole context of your lifestyle is absolutely important, that you don't correct one aspect of your lifestyle and not worry about the other. But there still seems to be this thought that we don't really need to worry about the health that we're going to have in our senior years until we retire. And that I'm arguing that that's not the case. Like osteoporosis, we're talking about lifeline processes, and that there are things that we should really be considering throughout our life course in order to ensure that we have the best cognitive capacity as we get into our senior years. And here I think what we're seeing is that midlife central adiposity, so people that are carrying their weight in their centers, seems to be a very independent risk factor, and it's over and above diabetes and cardiovascular abnormalities. But the real issue in here is that it's midlife. So we get a better indication of risk of obesity if we're looking at what people are carrying in their 50s relative to their 70s. And I think what that's just meaning is that the adverse metabolic consequences of obesity, the longer our brain is exposed to that, the more likely it's going to show deficits. So we're getting more and more indication that midlife health measures are actually better predictors of what your cognitive health is going to be in your 70s, rather than waiting making those measures on the day that you retire. So everything is arguing that this lifespan approach to cognitive health is more important. And I think where that becomes particularly poignant is the study that I was involved with, which was looking at a population that had a very high obesity risk in Canada. And we were looking at executive function, which is kind of being able to multitask, and showing that the obese individuals were at fourfold higher risk in terms of having deficits in their executive function, and that increased to fivefold if they were also carrying their adiposity centrally. But this is the sobering piece. The average age of our population is only 39 years of age. So in terms of looking at some of these adverse health consequences and how that can impact our cognitive health, and we're already starting to see the impact of some of these population changes on cognitive health in middle age, I think is very sobering. So the bottom line, I think, as we're saying, is that we really do need to concentrate on eating healthily, to recognize that our overall diet, I think, is far more important than any individual food or nutrient. That what we need to do as Canadians is start eating our veggies, eating our fruits and veggies, and then making sure that you're going on to whole grain, that you're replacing red meat with servings of fish, and that you're working to control the weight. I think the USDA has just come out with a new way of trying to help people understand what all of these recommendations are, and they call it My Plate. And the argument that they're saying is that when you sit down, that half your plate should be fruits and vegetables. Because I think the marketing in terms of saying so many servings just wasn't being effective, and so this is a new way of trying to do it. So half your plate is fruits and vegetables. And the rest is between your grains and your protein, be that fish, chicken, whatever. But I think to try and educate people in terms of what does it mean to be eating more fruits and vegetables, it's kind of a very strong pictorial in terms of what it needs to be. But I would continue to go back and say that while we have data associated with Mediterranean eating, that there are still many different ways to eat healthily. And I think that's really important because it allows us to, kind of revel in the cultural diversity that we have in Canada. It means that if I don't like souvlaki, It's not hugely important because I can choose to sit down and have Chinese dinner instead. So that I think it's also educating that while Mediterranean eating is a form of healthy eating, that actually we can embrace the diversity of cultures and foods that we have in Canada and still fall within healthy eating guidelines as long as we don't do this. So our Asian's not egg rolls, our North American is not poutine, and we're not looking at fried Mediterranean desserts in terms of adopting those different lifestyles. So there are things that we can do in terms of preserving our cognitive health when we age. We should be focusing not on any one different lifestyle, but really making certain that we are crossing all of those different lifestyle components. There is an important role with diet, and when should you be starting it, and the answer to that is yesterday. So with that, I would just like to thank the whole host of individuals that have been involved in our study. I think as we had mentioned in the flyer that we're in a process of putting together a cookbook at Baycrest that will be full of brain healthy recipes that will allow you to stay on track in terms of these diets. And we are always looking for volunteers to participate in our studies. So if there's anybody that would be interested in volunteering us to help understand these relationships between lifestyle and cognitive health, there's both an email and a phone number in terms of contacting us. So I know we're probably getting close to your time. Are there any other questions?
Yeah. Back to Health Canada. Again, the media tell us that Health Canada, especially recently under the current government, is under a lot of pressure not to interfere with business and to respond to the requirements of the lobby groups for dairy, meat production, and pharmaceutical, and so on. Is that in fact a concern that Health Canada has been basically declawed or defanged?
I guess that's a fence question, isn't it? In many ways, I would say that what you are arguing is true, but it's bigger than that. The degree to which we can have public health policy and food recommendations that are separate and distinct and different from the U.S. has been a problem. And I remember years ago, it used to be that the recommended intake of vitamin C was actually different in Canada and the U.S. So different expert groups sat down, we came up with different numbers, right? So it meant that you could have a bottle of orange juice that may allow you to meet 50% of your requirement for vitamin C if you purchased it and drank it in Vermont, but you took that bottle of orange juice and you came into Quebec, and now it only gave you 30% of what you needed. So there was, so you combine that in terms of, what does this mean at a public health level? And then clearly, no matter what, we are bombarded by a lot of American media and press. So that the argument at one level was that it was very confusing at a consumer level if we had different regulations. And you couple that with the political pressure of large agribusiness that would much rather process its foods in large plants and distribute it internationally than to have to be processing it locally. So that all of those, I think, clustered together. What it did end up with now is that our nutrition recommendations are actually done collaboratively and cooperatively. So it's a combination of Canadians and Americans that sit on those boards, and that we are adopting the same numbers that will help in terms of saying that an American doesn't need more vitamin C than a Canadian. So I think part of that is coming there. But America has very different levels of control, I guess, in terms of the freedom with which industry can, for instance, fortify food. So they've allowed, just as an example, these fully fortified breakfast cereals to be on the marketplace for a long time. So Product 19, there's a whole bunch of them where a single serving of the breakfast cereal will give you 100% of your nutrients, nutrient requirements, because they're very highly fortified. Yet Canada was very reticent to allow those products to come into the marketplace in Canada. And yes, there has been a lot of lobbying and pressuring around that. There has also been a lot of lobbying and pressuring around being able to put health claims on the front of pack. So Canadians have always been much more conservative and taken much more of a wait-and-see attitude, and that the large international companies, because they're wanting to be able to enhance their ability to trade internationally, are trying to get harmonization of regulations across different countries so that it allows for better trade and distribution of their food products. So are all of those, kind of forces there? The answer to that is yes. Anything else? Yep.
Sorry.
No.
Where does a potato fit on my plate?
It's kind of in that grain. Are you allowed to call it a vegetable? Not really. It's, and I think it's just because of its really large carbohydrate content. So potatoes are actually much more nutritious than we tend to talk about them. And the problem is that we make them unhealthy by adding butter and sour cream and deep frying them and all of those types of things.
So a baked potato is a good potato.
A baked potato is a fabulous potato, as long as you're not loading it up with sour cream in it.
It's sustained the Irish for generations.
Absolutely. I know potatoes are incredibly nutritious. They're almost a complete food. I mean, as you say, it's there, but it tends to get clustered into that grain category. So you're looking at rice or potato or pasta or something like that in terms of taking up that grain, and that other part is supposed to be green or red or yellow or whatever. It's not supposed to be white.
That was a wonderful overview you gave us.
Oh, thank you.
I have to tell you.
Thank you.
It's excellent.
And was there another question? Okay. And then the other is, if there is anyone left in the audience that's interested in participating, William, who's a student with me, has some sign-up sheets as well. So thank you very much, and it was a delight to talk to everybody.